Well, hello everyone. My name is Michelle Christensen, and I am the Manager of Government Relations and Advocacy with Cerebral Palsy Alberta. So in my role, I oversee the Alberta Ability Network and Barrier Free Alberta. And also joining me today is actually my boss. It's Elizabeth Coletta, and she's the Director of Social Inclusion and Support Services, who's also with CPAA. So we've got a few people in the waiting room. There we go. So just before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping matters. I would ask that everyone turn their audio to mute during the presentation and keep it off until we have that question sharing portion. And just to let you know that we will be recording Patty's part of the presentation, and then we're going to turn the recording off for the sharing portion so that people can feel like they can share and it not go anywhere other than within this group. So you can, when we open it up, you can certainly put your hand up. So you go to the bottom of your thing and you'll see hand up, and you just hit that button and we'll get to your question. Or you also have the option to put it in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that to ensure that we're getting everyone's questions. We may take a look if there's lots of questions and see if there are some that are similar, or maybe combine them into one, just depending on time. So we'll just see how that goes. And I think that's it for housekeeping matters. So before we start the official part, I just want to provide the land acknowledgement. So the Alberta Ability Network gratefully acknowledges that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territories and gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant communities. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis settlements, and 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. All right, so I think this is an important topic, and I'm really glad that so many of you have joined us. We know that 2025 has been an exceptionally difficult year for the disability community in our province. At the beginning of the year, the Alberta government has cut funding to self-advocacy groups. The next month, they announced the Disability Assistance Program and changes to AISH. Then a couple months later, they made the decision to claw back the Canada Disability Benefit and force people to apply for it so that they could claw that back. And then they also changed the rent supplement program for folks living in community housing. So we know that all of this has contributed to people feeling very anxious and fearful. So our goal today is to start a dialogue on reframing how we deal with these changes. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Many of you know her already from her contributions to ANN and probably other places. Her contributions to ANN was specifically in the area of poverty reduction is where Patty has made the greatest impact. And so here we go. Patty is an assistant adjunct professor with the Community Rehabilitation Disability Studies program at the University of Calgary. She brings a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I'm very grateful that she is with us to share some of that today. So over to you, Patty.
Oh, gee, thanks a lot, Michelle. And hi, my screen is kind of wonky. I've got the presentation on one screen and everybody else on another. And so there's good parts and there's bad parts of that because I get to see who all the names of people who are on there in here, and certainly see some familiar names. I'm happy to see that there are others who were just interested in this topic. So one of the things that I was just talking to Elizabeth and Michelle before we opened the room, and one of the things that sort of predicated this topic and and that is the idea that certainly in my 35 plus years being involved in work within the disability community in the various roles that I've played, I think this is maybe one of the first times where the work that we've done has been in pushing back against things being taken away, as opposed to sort of the fight of getting things, getting funding, getting recognition, being seen as valued. The story changes. The story is always changing, and so sometimes having these conversations about how our stories need to change can be important as well. And so that's why I thought it was or Michelle and I thought that this kind of topic was rather timely. I'm not coming to this as I look at the people who are on this. I'm certainly not coming to this as someone who intends to school you or educate you on what what this information is. I'm coming from a place that I'm assuming that nothing I'm going to be presenting is going to be particularly new. Hopefully everybody now just doesn't click off because I've said that. But really it's from that place of saying that if we have to learn to tell a different story, if we have to learn to take up this work in some different ways, then how do we learn to pivot and take this work up in different ways and bring different viewpoints? And so that's really kind of my intent in this, is to be able to just remind you of some things, maybe reframe some things. And then I want to be able to open up the room to be having conversations within it with everybody about how we maybe take that up and think about how we take this approach this work. So that's what I meant when we were talking about unpacking passive ableism and thinking about what that means within our own biases within the work we do. And so, as I said, part of the reason that, and Michelle, if you can't see me changing the slides, will you just wave? Because I can't tell if the slides have changed on your end. As I've said, it's really about understanding our own biases and recognizing that we do have biases. I come from a place where I recognize that we have biases, and I sometimes, when I'm teaching students and I'm telling them, if you don't have biases, people who say, if somebody says, well, I have no biases, then I often ask them, well, what do you stand for then? Because we all come to this work because of the fact that we have certain biases. Part of the work, our own work, is really in recognizing where those biases lie, who they serve, and then based on that, in what ways might we need to revisit things and reframe things and ask ourselves questions about the work that are the ways that our biases inform us. So it is about recognizing our biases and then learning to mitigate those in the right ways, in the right time. And so one of the tools that we use a lot in academia and the work that I've done in more community-based, I mean, I have the privilege of being involved in an academic program and educating students to be able to think the way I know community members want new professionals to be able to think and to bring new ideas. But I also have the privilege of doing a lot of community-based research and working with community through my role as a practicum coordinator with the Community Rehab and Disability Studies program at the University of Calgary. So one of the things that we use in terms of thinking about bias and asking ourselves about where bias lies and how we approach it is really one of the tools that we use is something called the bias-free framework. And it was developed by Eschler. And it's a three-point triangle that really kind of organizes different types of biases into different categories. And it's generally used in health education or in health research, but a colleague of mine, Dr. Gregor Wahlberg, he taught it to me from a place that it can be applicable to any situation and every type of community. And so it is really about looking at all the different ways that power is unequally distributed, who has power, who says they have power, but they don't really, or who says they don't have power, but they actually do. So looking at all those different kinds of areas, and there's lots of different ways that you can look at that. It's also about another category that we look at in terms of discerning bias is where are there places where people ignore difference when difference is really important and really the whole point of the thing? And so a good example of that in health research is, some of the work that's the original work that was done in sort of cardiac care, and recognizing that if health researchers knew about how to support or how to treat people who have heart attacks, then they would be able to do it. But then recognizing that all the research that was being done was done on males, and the idea that how women experience heart attacks and the signs of heart attack are very different. So that idea of ignoring differences when the difference is really the point. But then conversely, thinking about how are people treated differently because of how they present, when actually how they present has nothing to do with what's going on. So those three sort of areas are areas that we can sort of dig into and explore in terms of what they mean, and how it is that you can interrogate that both for yourself and for others. And so some of the good examples, and this isn't just, like I said, this isn't disability related, although we use it in our own work as far as critical disability studies, but it is applicable to almost anything. And so we do an assignment with students where we ask them to identify different types of biases in different areas. And so one of the ones that stands out for me, I always remember in terms of maintaining unequal distribution of power, was the idea that, and I don't know if a lot of you remember years ago when the government first started mandating flu shots. I don't know how long that would be, maybe 10, 12 years ago. And if you were, maybe more, I think my kids were smaller. I can remember going and everybody standing in line at these health clinics to get the flu shots because the government was saying, well, no, everybody's being treated equal. Everybody has to stand in line to get them. And then it came out in the news that, well, but, the Flames had their own private flu clinic, and they brought their families and their friends to the flu clinic. So that idea that there is no hierarchy, but then actually there is a hierarchy, is certainly one of those areas that we can kind of look at society through that biased lens. The other piece that I wanted to bring forward is, again, I don't assume that the models, the medical and the social model, is something new to anybody on these calls. Recognizing that the notion of medical model thinking is really situated in the idea that somebody with a disability, everything, all the challenges that they face are located within their bodies, and the labels that are attached to them, and that the whole notion of of that idea of being fixed, and that the if and then, if you have this treatment, then you will be able to be included. If you get this support, then you will be able to participate. If you get this medicine, then you will be better. Or that idea is really located largely in that medical model perspective. Whereas through the social model, it is that recognition that it isn't the issue of the person at hand, but how it is that our society has been built, and the ways that as societies that we limit and isolate individuals with disabilities. Now, those are two ends of the spectrum, and there's lots of different ways of looking at things that kind of fall in between. But one of the things that I think is important to bring up in this is the notion that the medical model, sometimes it gets kind of wrapped up that, oh, that's only within medicine. And the reality is that the medical model is so deeply embedded in it's sort of the zeitgeist of how our society thinks, that it comes through in a lot of different ways, whether it's looking at how our education system operates and the ideas of gatekeeping. If you get a diagnosis, then you get access to services. That comes through in social work. It comes through in medicine. It comes through in so many different ways that we don't always necessarily recognize that the idea of the if And then is what predicates or kind of gives us clues about what kind of bias or what kind of lens an individual or an institution are holding. There's also problems, or not problems, I won't say problems, that sounds really, but there's also, issues about the social model because it is perceived that the social model is just largely seen through an environmental lens. And so the idea that, well, as long as we've got the curb cuts in and as long as, there's little, there's braille on the elevator buttons and that, well, then we're good. We've change the environment so that people have better access to things. But the issues at hand are not the visible ones for the most part. They're not the things that you can change from a structural perspective. I think the work that we need to be doing and the pressure points that we need to be thinking about are in those attitudinal and institutional areas where we're looking at how is it that somebody holds that medical model perspective as an attitude and how they bring that to the table when they're thinking about how services are delivered. How is it that that idea that disability lives within the person's body, and therefore they design institutional programs that reflect that? And so it's not just thinking, oh, we just need to change it, and if we change it, everything will be lovely. But it is about the work is really in telling our stories in order to shift attitude and to see things in a different lens. And so I like the idea, or I really kind of challenge people a lot of times to think about disability and how we think about it as a social construct. Because we really, in our society, that whole notion and the idea of moving and thinking about people's attitudes and how those attitudes then get expressed within the institutions that we and the systems that we deal with. The notion is really that, that depends on where you're at and how it is that you live. And so I can't see anybody here, so I can't like push, I get, the only person I can see is Michelle. So, but the thing is, we as a society kind of frame disability from a place that says, it's okay to have these kinds of impairments, and we can only, this kind of impairment is acceptable, or we're not necessarily going to identify it as a disability, but then when it gets to a certain point, then we do. And so oftentimes with students, I always, invite them to think about the fact that, I have a vision impairment. And the very fact that but nobody says to me, well, you're disabled because of your vision impairment. Some people hide it, they'll work to hide it by wearing contacts but when my vision impairment gets to a point, and I'm never quite sure, like at what point is somebody going to then say, okay, well, that vision impairment has now, ticked over to that it's now a disability. Is it because when I move from single lens glasses to progressives, or is it when somebody says, oh, well, we can't necessarily correct your vision anymore? Those are decisions that as a society we generally make. And so to recognize that there are hierarchies within that also becomes a piece that we want to kind of look at in terms of bias. So this sense of what's normal. Normal is a fallacy. It's not something that, it's normal is, that is really just the idea of, I don't know who's normal. We can think about bodies and from a perspective of form and function, and we can think about it in terms of perhaps in some ways when we're looking at in different contexts about what how the different ideas of optimal. But to assume that there is some level of normal and abnormal really kind of then leans back into those ideas of, looking at how do you fix something or how do you correct a structure so that somebody can then get into a space. But if they get into the space, but nobody pays attention to them, then that's still the issue is still the issue. So how is it that we can take that up? So we can move through it by recognizing that ableism is one of those isms that oftentimes doesn't get outside of our community, doesn't get acknowledged, and certainly gets but is deeply woven into a lot of the organizations and institutions that serve our community. And so that idea that a body that seeks that normal or strives for that normal or optimal form and function somehow takes precedence over the ways that our bodies look different and function different, and that are, those isms that fall not unlike a lot of the other sort of social constructs around racism and feminism and sexism and ageism. All of ableism is as important within that kind of area that we need to recognize and then be able to call out when we see it. And so it's really easy to sort of recognize some of those active ways that that people practice it. But I think what's really important for us to start to recognize are those really passive ways, the ways that don't necessarily speak to that make you sort of, you have to think about it for a second, or that it's not necessarily in your face. And so it's really kind of looking at the different ways, like organizations, or in this case, institutions that assume that if that that you have to have all this gatekeeping around the services and supports that you receive, because somehow, if they don't check, that there's going to be people who are taking advantage of the system. That's really passive ableism. The idea that I don't know if any of you remember, but there's been years, they don't do it anymore, but I mean, for years, in order to make sure that my kids continued to have access to Handy Bus, I had to wheel their wheelchairs into a space so that somebody could go, yep, okay, yeah, you're still in a wheelchair. It's all good, stamp the book, and now they can still get access. So that idea that somehow that people were taking advantage of the system, and therefore they had to weed out all those people. That's really a form of passive ableism. The assumption that that people are that people rely on some of the social services that are offered because they can't be bothered to work. Again, another form of passive ableism. All of these are kind of ways that we can start to really ask ourselves, is that really it's not just the questions of, well, what happened to you, or what's wrong with you, but really some of those more insidious ways that we see this ableism being practiced. And so I wanted to kind of, moving from that, I wanted to kind of invite people to start thinking about, it seems that a lot of times in the work that we do and in the advocacy that we take up, that we often tend to lean into the idea of a rights-based framework, the idea that disability rights are human rights, and that it's our right to have access to these things, and those are very important frameworks to work within. The litigation and the policy structures that have been created are created because of the fact that people's voices haven't been heard, that they've been ignored and devalued. And so So the idea that those things have been put into place are important. But I also think when we're working from exclusively a rights-based perspective, that we don't necessarily have a plan B when somebody just basically either denies our rights or decides that they're not necessarily going to adhere to the legal structures or policies that exist. And so I wanted to introduce, and again, I'm not assuming that people haven't been introduced to this, but I really wanted to open up a conversation about it, is the idea of a disability justice framework. And what a disability justice framework moves from, what are what are my rights to what is the right thing to do, and works from that sort of moral or human perspective. And from that perspective, we can think about and recognize that all bodies are unique and essential, and that we're not taking into consideration, or we're not assuming that there is a hierarchy even within the disability community, because we know that it exists. But that we see ourselves as powerful despite those complexities, that who we are and that our disabilities are or something that is what makes our lives full and adds texture to our lives. It also recognizes that everybody has strengths and needs, not just the people with IPPs and ISPs. The notion that communities and all individuals within a community have certain strengths and needs to be able to draw on. And finally, to recognize that we can work with other organizations and other interest groups, because oftentimes through that intersectionality, some of the work that's being done by other groups, we can sort of advance our work along as well. And so I think that's an important kind of conversation to have at this time when we see so many minority groups being targeted within our society right now. And so moving from disability rights to disability justice kind of is predicated on 10 principles. The first one being around intersectionality and noting that disability is just one aspect of a person's life, and that it may or may not be a central part in terms of how they see their identity, and that's up to them. Certainly through identity, the different kinds of language. People talk about person first language versus identity first language, and the notion that disability be seen as an equally invalued personal identity is a personal choice for anybody who claims that identity. But also recognizing that there are multiple other identities that every one of, any other person holds. And so it is then also then moving from seeing that and taking that up to then reaching out around those cross movement solidarities. So working with other social movements and building off of the types of things that they have done to be able to understand and create a better context around ableism, being able to understand or being able to communicate what is actually ableism and what might not be. The disability justice framework then also sort of takes up that idea of that anti-capitalistic politic, and I just realized I have a typo on my slide that I forgot to change. That sees that not everybody's value is located in what they can produce or what they can contribute. John O'Brien has this really, really lovely, he says this one really lovely line that he says, everybody has gifts, and it's really just about wanting to find out what gifts each person brings. And so that idea of not locating all of the work in just what kind of value you can contribute back to society, because all people contribute, regardless of whether it's kind of within the context of what we have as a society have assigned as being valued and contributing. It's recognizing the wholeness of everyone again, and through that, then valuing and taking the lead from those who are most impacted by our community. So the voices, and again, these are the things that I know you already know, valuing and taking into account what people who live with disabilities and people who are affected by those people in terms of how their lives are affected. Those are the people that need to be heard and have the loudest voices. It is about recognizing and making a commitment to those cross-disability solidarities, and knowing that the issues at hand are not located just within different, sort of the different silos of not even just labels in terms of disability, but capacity in terms of physical versus cognitive or complex. It's not about seeing different disabilities as being their own best advocates, but working together with all groups, which is, I think, what's so important about these types of um, of meetings and sessions, is bringing people together from all sorts of organizations. It's also about recognizing that through that, it is promoting and advancing the notion of interdependence. It's always really interesting to me that oftentimes when I've sat in meetings with not only my own children, but with on behalf of other people, that the focus is always sort of on how do we increase somebody's independence. And I think what we have to learn to recognize and embrace and perhaps promote is that nobody lives an independent life. And to assume that somebody needs more independence really then makes them a lot more isolated. And that it's about finding the ways that we can advance people to be able to take control of their lives, but also then recognizing and embracing all the different ways that we need to be interdependent with each other, and and places where we already are interdependent. It's about pacing ourselves and finding the kinds of approaches that a sustained can have a sustained impact, not only on the institutions that we're advocating to, but to the communities that we're hoping to educate, because the reality is that some of the institutions that have the power to make decisions on our behalf are put there because of the way the community has made choices. And so to be able to advocate on behalf of the areas that we want to be able to promote to the larger community is a sort of a larger and bigger kind of aim star in the sky. And then certainly taking up that collective access and liberation around noting that we can work collectively with other organizations, not just within the disability community, but certainly within other communities that are taking up this and dealing with similar types of barriers and marginalization. And so that's really kind of that idea of how do we take that and look at it not just as it's my right to have this or it's our right to get it, but what is the right thing to do, and appealing to people's moral and ethical perspectives. Sometimes when you ask those questions by people who are making decisions, you can get a very different answer. And so that's kind of where that's where I'm kind of wanting to kind of push this, and over the next, I hope 20 minutes or 15 minutes, we can look at, and will that be okay, Michelle? Okay. We can
Yes.
look at not from a place of really just sharing about, how do you think taking up some of the aspects of more of a disability justice framework might serve our community better at this point, or maybe not better, but just be another level if you're not already doing it. And then how do you take that and address it to look at your own biases and intentionality in addressing the active and passive ableism that we're actually seeing, in our communities right now, just as Michelle so aptly kind of framed up at the beginning of this presentation. And so I'm hoping, Michelle and Elizabeth, that maybe what we can do is just everybody can just unmute. And I'd really just love to, I think this is what I'd really just like to have a really conversation around what are people doing, how are people taking this up, and is there anything from, what I've touched on today that might allow us to kind of take a step back and pivot a little bit?
Terrific. Thank you, Patty. I'm going to turn off the recording now, so this discussion will not be recorded.